The children gathered in small clusters across the dusty campus grounds, their faces marked by confusion and fear. It was January of 1942, and the gates of the University of Santo Tomas in Manila had just closed behind them, transforming what had once been a place of learning into a prison camp. Among the thousands of civilians being herded through registration were over 400 children, some clutching parents' hands, others standing alone, separated by chaos. They ranged from infants to teenagers, American, British, Dutch, caught in the sudden storm of Japanese occupation. None understood what captivity would mean or how long the barbed wire would hold them. The campus, with its Spanish colonial buildings and wide courtyards, seemed almost normal at first glance. The main building stood imposing and elegant, its cream-colored stone and arched windows speaking of scholarship and civilization. Gardens that had once hosted students now became gathering places for the imprisoned. Trees provided shade where children would spend countless hours in the years to come. But the children quickly learned that appearances deceived. Armed Japanese guards patrolled the perimeter, their bayonets glinting in the tropical sun. Families were assigned to cramped dormitories, 40 or 50 people sharing spaces designed for a dozen. Privacy vanished. Personal belongings were inspected, confiscated, or lost in the confusion. For children who had grown up in comfortable Manila homes with servants and spacious rooms, the sudden shift was jarring. Many came from families of businessmen, missionaries, teachers, and diplomats who had made lives in the Philippines. Their childhoods had been filled with birthday parties, swimming at beaches, meals prepared by cooks. Now they pressed against their parents, searching for reassurance that never fully came. The reality of captivity settled slowly, like dust after an explosion. First came disbelief, then confusion, and finally a creeping understanding that this was not temporary. The gates had closed, and no one knew when they might open again. That first night, as darkness fell over Santo Tomas, the reality settled in with crushing weight. Children lay on thin mats spread across concrete floors, listening to the sounds of crying, whispered prayers, and restless movement. The air was thick with humidity and fear. Mosquitoes buzzed endlessly, and the heat seemed to press down from above. Many had been torn from their normal lives without warning, fathers arrested at work, families given minutes to pack. Some children had been separated from parents entirely, sent to the camp with neighbors or relatives, promised they would be reunited soon. Those promises, like so many others, would fade as months stretched into years. The youngest children, barely old enough to understand, asked questions their parents could not answer. When can we go home? Why are the soldiers angry? Will we see Daddy again? Mothers and fathers stumbled through explanations, trying to shield their children from the full horror of the situation. But children are perceptive, and even the youngest sensed that something terrible had happened. They saw the fear in adult eyes, heard the trembling in voices that tried to sound reassuring. Some withdrew into silence, refusing to speak for days. Others clung desperately to routines, insisting on bedtime stories or prayers, grasping at fragments of normalcy. The morning routines began almost immediately. Roll calls at dawn forced everyone into lines, children standing beside adults as Japanese officers counted and recounted, making sure no one had vanished in the night. The children learned to stand still, to keep quiet, to avoid drawing attention. Even the smallest mistake, a fidget, a whisper, could bring a sharp reprimand or worse. Guards who showed no mercy to adults showed even less patience for the restlessness of youth. Fear became a constant companion, teaching children to suppress their natural energy and curiosity. One young girl, barely 7 years old, remembered years later how she learned to become invisible. She would stand perfectly still during roll call, eyes forward, breathing shallow, willing herself to disappear. She had seen a boy roughly her age slapped across the face for laughing during count. The sound of that slap echoed in her memory forever. From that moment, she understood that childhood as she had known it was over. Play was dangerous. Laughter could bring punishment. Even tears had to be hidden. Food was the first great shock. Rations distributed by the Japanese were meager from the start, thin soups of rice and vegetables, occasionally scraps of fish or meat so small they barely registered. Children who had once complained about vegetables on their dinner plates now fought hunger that gnawed constantly. Mothers tried to shield their young, giving up portions to feed growing bodies, but there was never enough. Within weeks, the children began to change. Cheeks that had been full grew hollow. Energy that once seemed boundless faded. Even play, that most essential childhood activity, became subdued as malnutrition took hold. The meals themselves became rituals of disappointment. Children lined up with borrowed bowls or tin cups, watching as ladles dipped into large pots of watery lugao, a rice porridge stretched thin to feed thousands. Sometimes there would be bits of vegetables, wilted and nearly flavorless. On rare occasions, a sliver of fish appeared, and children would examine it carefully, making it last as long as possible. They learned to eat slowly, to chew each bite deliberately, trying to trick their stomachs into feeling satisfied. Parents watched in agony as portions that would barely satisfy a toddler had to sustain growing children. The psychological impact of constant hunger changed how children thought about everything. Food became the center of every conversation, every thought, every dream. Children who had once played house or soldiers now played elaborate games about feasts and restaurants. They would describe in excruciating detail the meals they remembered from before, building entire fantasies around chocolate cake, fried chicken, or fresh fruit. These conversations were both comfort and torture, offering escape while highlighting what they had lost. Some children began hoarding anything edible, hiding scraps under mattresses or in pockets, terrified that the next meal might never come. The camp organized a makeshift school. Desperate parents and teachers determined that education should not die behind the wire. Classes met in shaded corners of buildings or under trees, using scraps of paper and improvised materials. Children learned mathematics, English, history, all while guards watched from a distance. The teachers, themselves prisoners, tried to maintain normalcy, to preserve some fragment of the world these children had lost. But how do you teach hope when every day is marked by scarcity and confinement? How do you speak of futures when the present is so uncertain? The schooling effort was remarkable in its persistence. Teachers who had once stood before proper classrooms now conducted lessons sitting on the ground, using sticks to write in dirt when paper ran out. Mathematics problems were drawn on precious scraps saved from packages. Reading lessons used whatever books had been smuggled into camp. Volumes passed from child to child until pages fell out. History became living memory as adults shared stories of the world before the war, trying to keep that world alive in young minds. For the children, school offered more than education. It provided structure, routine, a sense that normal life might somehow continue. When sitting under a tree learning multiplication tables, a child could almost forget the guards, the fences, The hunger? Almost. The lessons were constantly interrupted by the realities of camp life. Roll calls, work details, illness, all disrupted the fragile schedule. But the teachers persisted, and the children absorbed what they could, clinging to knowledge as proof that they were more than prisoners. The children, resilient in ways adults could not foresee, created their own society within the camp. They formed friendships that crossed national boundaries, American children playing with British, Dutch mixing with Australian. In the courtyards, they invented games with whatever they could find: rocks, sticks, scraps of fabric. They built imaginary worlds where the fences did not exist, where soldiers were not watching, where freedom was more than a fading memory. These games were acts of defiance, small rebellions against the reality that sought to crush their spirits. A group of boys created an elaborate game involving collecting and trading objects found around the camp. A button could be worth 3 pebbles. A piece of colored glass was treasure beyond measure. They established rules, hierarchies, and elaborate negotiations that consumed hours. For them, this game was everything. It gave them agency, control, purpose in a world where adults made all decisions and children were powerless. They guarded their collections fiercely, hiding treasures in secret places, and the loss of a prized possession could bring tears that hunger could not. Yet the hardships multiplied relentlessly. As 1942 turned into 1943 and 1943 into 1944, conditions deteriorated with brutal inevitability. The Japanese, struggling with their own supply shortages as the war turned against them, reduced rations further. Diseases swept through the crowded dormitories with terrifying speed. Dysentery, malaria, beriberi, dengue fever all thrived in the unsanitary conditions. Children fell ill, their small bodies unable to fight infections without proper nutrition or medicine. Camp hospitals, staffed by imprisoned doctors and nurses, did what they could with almost nothing. Parents sat beside cots, watching their children burn with fever, helpless to do more than offer comfort and prayer. The medical situation grew increasingly desperate. Doctors performed surgeries without anesthesia. Nurses fashioned bandages from torn clothing. Medicines that did exist were carefully rationed, reserved for the most critical cases. Parents faced impossible decisions, watching their children suffer and knowing that treatment might not come. Some children survived illnesses that should have killed them, their small bodies somehow finding reserves of strength. Others succumbed to conditions that would have been easily treatable in the world outside the wire. The sounds of illness filled the nights. Coughing that would not stop, moans of pain from those too weak to cry out loudly, the whispered prayers of parents keeping vigil. Children learned to recognize the signs of serious illness in their friends. They knew when someone disappeared from school that they might not return. Death became a presence in the camp, never discussed openly, but always hovering at the edges of consciousness. The children grew solemn, their eyes taking on a haunted quality that no child should possess. Some children lost parents to disease or malnutrition. Orphaned within the camp, they were absorbed by other families, strangers becoming surrogate mothers and fathers. The bonds formed in those circumstances were unlike anything the children had known before. Shared suffering created connections deeper than blood, forged in the desperate need to survive together. Children learned to care for one another, older ones watching over younger, sharing scraps of food, offering shoulders to cry on when the loneliness became too heavy. One boy, orphaned at age 9 when both parents succumbed to dysentery within weeks of each other, was taken in by a missionary family who already had 3 children of their own. They had barely enough food for themselves, but they made room. The boy never forgot that kindness. Decades later, he would say that the family who took him in when they had nothing to give taught him what humanity truly meant. He became like a brother to their children, and they remained close long after the war ended. The psychological toll was invisible but deep. Children who should have been learning to ride bicycles and attending birthday parties instead learned about hunger, loss, and fear. They witnessed adults breaking under the strain, saw families torn apart by arguments over food or space. They heard the screams of those punished by guards for minor infractions. The innocence that defines childhood was stripped away, replaced by a hardness that would mark them for life. Yet amid the darkness, something remarkable emerged. These children developed a resilience, a strength born of necessity that would define the rest of their days. They learned to read adult moods with uncanny accuracy, sensing when to stay quiet, when to offer comfort, when to disappear. They became experts at making themselves useful, helping with chores, caring for younger children, running errands. This usefulness was both survival strategy and psychological necessity. By contributing, they felt less helpless, less like victims. They took pride in their capabilities, in the fact that adults relied on them. In this way, they reclaimed fragments of dignity that captivity sought to destroy. Some children took on roles far beyond their years. 12-year-olds cared for infants while mothers worked. 10-year-olds helped in the hospital, fetching water, changing bandages, offering comfort to the dying. Teenagers organized work crews, taught classes to younger children, and served as messengers between different areas of the camp. They grew up fast, skipping over entire stages of development, moving directly from childhood to a kind of premature adulthood forged in crisis. By late 1944, the camp had become a shadow of its former self. The Japanese, losing ground across the Pacific, grew harsher and more unpredictable. Rations were cut to starvation levels. The thin soups became thinner. Vegetables disappeared entirely. Sometimes days would pass with nothing but a handful of rice per person. Children who had already been thin became skeletal. Ribs showed through skin like xylophone keys. Eyes sank into skulls, making faces look ancient. Arms and legs became stick-thin, barely able to support weakened bodies. The energy to play disappeared entirely. Children sat listlessly in the shade, too weak to move, watching the world with dull eyes. Parents watched in agony as their children wasted away, powerless to stop it. Mothers who had once been plump themselves now looked like living skeletons, having given every scrap of food to their young. Fathers grew hollow-eyed and desperate, willing to risk anything for a few extra calories for their families. Some died, small bodies too weak to continue. Makeshift graves in corners of the campus marked the ultimate price of captivity. Each burial was attended by silent crowds of witnesses, children watching as friends were laid to rest, understanding with terrible clarity that they might be next. The mortality rate among children climbed through 1944. Malnutrition weakened immune systems to the point where even minor illnesses became fatal. A simple cold could progress to pneumonia. A small cut could become infected and spread through a body too weak to fight. Mothers counted their children's heartbeats at night, terrified to find them slowing. The camp hospital overflowed with dying children, and doctors made agonizing decisions about who might be saved and who was too far gone. Yet even in this darkest period, life persisted. The children who survived did so through a combination of luck, stubbornness, and the fierce determination of adults who sacrificed everything to keep them alive. Smuggling operations, dangerous and often deadly, brought in small amounts of food. Internees risked brutal punishment to slip vegetables, eggs, or rice to families with children. Some prisoners worked outside the camp under guard and found ways to hide food on their bodies or in tools. Others bribed guards who showed even a flicker of humanity, trading watches, rings, or other valuables for a few bananas or a small sack of sugar. The smuggling networks were elaborate and constantly evolving. Children played roles in these operations, their small size and seeming innocence making them ideal couriers. They would carry messages, hide food and clothing, or create diversions while adults completed transactions. It was dangerous work. Those caught faced punishment ranging from beatings to solitary confinement, or worse, but the risk was worth it when the alternative was watching children starve to death. Every calorie mattered. Every bite could mean the difference between life and death. Mothers developed elaborate systems for ensuring fairness, carefully dividing tiny portions so each child received exactly the same amount. Some families ate together, making it a ritual that preserved dignity. Others fed children first, then divided what remained among adults. The mathematics of survival became a constant calculation, balancing current hunger against long-term survival, deciding whether to eat now or save for later. Then on a February morning in 1945, the sound that changed everything. The rumble of engines, distant at first, then growing louder. American tanks crashed through the gates of Santo Tomas, tearing down the barriers that had held the prisoners for 3 years. The earth shook with the weight of the armored vehicles. Guards scattered or surrendered. Soldiers poured into the camp, weapons ready, only to find thousands of emaciated civilians, many too weak to cheer. Children stared at the uniforms, processing slowly that liberation had finally come. Some cried. Others remained silent, as if afraid to believe it was real. A few, too weak to react, simply continued to lie still, barely registering the commotion around them. The liberation of Santo Tomas on February 3, 1945, was chaotic and emotional. American soldiers from the 1st Cavalry Division had raced to reach the camp, knowing that prisoners were on the verge of starvation. When they burst through the gates, they were not prepared for what they found. The soldiers who entered Santo Tomas that day were not prepared for the sight before them. They had expected prisoners, but the sight of children, skeletal and hollow-eyed, shook even the most hardened veterans. These were men who had seen combat across the Pacific, who had witnessed death and destruction, yet nothing prepared them for starving children. Some soldiers broke down and wept. Others moved immediately into action, distributing their own rations, calling for medics, gathering children into their arms. Medics rushed forward, distributing food and medicine, but liberation came with its own dangers. Bodies starved for so long could not process rich food. The medical term was refeeding syndrome, and it could be fatal. Children had to be carefully, slowly reintroduced to nutrition. Doctors who had kept people alive with almost nothing now faced the challenge of preventing death from abundance. Some prisoners, overcome with joy at the sight of real food, ate too much too fast and suffered terribly. Some tragically did not survive the transition, their bodies too damaged by years of deprivation to recover, even with help finally at hand. The American soldiers shared everything they had. They gave up their rations, their chocolate bars, their cigarettes to trade for food. They brought in supplies as quickly as possible, but the logistics of feeding thousands of starving people were complex. Medical personnel set up treatment centers, carefully monitoring each patient's intake. Children were given diluted milk, soft foods, and gradually increasing portions. It was agonizing for parents to watch their children beg for more food and have to refuse, knowing that more could kill them. In the days following liberation, the children of Santo Tomas began the long, painful process of returning to a world they barely remembered. Families reunited, though many discovered that not everyone had survived. Fathers who had been held in separate camps appeared at the gates, searching for wives and children. Some reunions were joyful, families made whole again. Others were heartbreaking, as children learned that parents had died in other camps, or parents discovered that children had not survived Santo Tomas. The emotional toll of these moments was overwhelming, joy and grief intertwining in ways that left people stunned and exhausted. Letters home, carefully composed, tried to explain what had happened. But how do you put 3 years of captivity into words? The children struggled to articulate their experiences, finding that the outside world could not truly comprehend what they had endured. They wrote about being hungry, but how do you convey the reality of starvation? They mentioned being scared, but how do you explain the constant, gnawing terror of captivity? Many gave up trying to explain, simply saying they were fine, they had survived, they were coming home. The process of leaving the Philippines took weeks. The children had to regain enough strength to travel. Medical examinations revealed the extent of the damage: malnutrition, parasitic infections, dental problems, stunted growth, psychological trauma. Doctors documented everything, creating records that would later help historians understand the full scope of suffering. As they were evacuated from the Philippines, children pressed their faces to the windows of ships and planes, watching the islands recede. Many carried nothing but the clothes on their backs, all possessions lost or left behind. Yet they carried something heavier, invisible but permanent. The memories of Santo Tomas, of hunger and fear, of friends lost and lessons learned, would follow them forever. They had been imprisoned as children, but they emerged as something else. Survivors marked by trauma, but unbroken. The journey home was surreal. After years of captivity, the world seemed impossibly large, bright, overwhelming. Children who had lived within the confines of a single campus now saw oceans, cities, landscapes stretching to the horizon. Some felt agoraphobic, uncomfortable with so much space. Others felt disconnected, as if they were watching the world through glass rather than participating in it. Years later, when historians began to piece together the story of Santo Tomas, the children's voices proved essential. They remembered details adults had forgotten, recalled moments of kindness amid cruelty, and testified to the resilience of the human spirit. They spoke of teachers who continued lessons with no books, of mothers who sang lullabies in the darkest hours, of friends who shared their last scraps of food. They remembered the games played in dusty courtyards, the laughter that defied despair, the small acts of rebellion that kept hope alive. Their testimonies became crucial historical documents. Researchers interviewing former child internees discovered that they often had clearer memories than adults, perhaps because the experience was so formative, so utterly different from anything a child should experience. that every detail remained vivid. They remembered names of guards, the exact layout of buildings, the taste of the watery soups, the feeling of the concrete floors, the sound of the gates closing at night. These memories, painful as they were, helped create a comprehensive picture of life in Santo Tomas. The legacy of Santo Tomas children is complex and enduring. Many struggled with the trauma for decades, plagued by nightmares and survivor's guilt. They woke screaming from dreams of starvation. They hoarded food compulsively, unable to throw anything away. They struggled with intimacy and trust, the psychological damage of captivity manifesting in their relationships. Some turned to alcohol or other means of numbing the pain. Others withdrew into silence, unable or unwilling to speak of what they had endured. But others channeled their experiences into advocacy, determination that the world would never forget what had happened to civilian prisoners of war. They wrote memoirs, gave testimonies at schools and universities, and ensured that younger generations understood the cost of conflict. They became educators, therapists, and activists, using their pain to prevent future suffering. They wrote books, appeared in documentaries, and spoke at commemorations. Their stories became part of the broader narrative of World War II, a reminder that war's victims are not only soldiers, but the innocent caught in its path. For those who lived through Santo Tomas as children, the camp never truly left them. It appeared in dreams, in moments of hunger, in the instinct to hoard food or protect loved ones fiercely. It shaped how they raised their own children, often with an intensity born of knowing how fragile security can be. They taught their sons and daughters to value freedom, to never take meals for granted, to understand that civilization is more fragile than it appears. Some struggled to find balance, alternating between overprotection and the recognition that their children needed to live without the shadow of their parents' trauma. The physical scars faded over time. Bodies that had been skeletal filled out. Growth that had been stunted resumed, though many former child internees remained shorter than they might have been. Dental problems persisted, teeth damaged by malnutrition, never fully recovering. But these visible marks were minor compared to the invisible ones. The psychological impact lasted lifetimes, shaping personalities, relationships, and worldviews in profound ways. The barbed wire of Santo Tomas was torn down decades ago. The university returned to its purpose, educating new generations who walk the same courtyards where children once played amid captivity. Plaques and memorials now mark what happened there, ensuring that visitors understand the site's history. But for the children who spent years behind that wire, the camp remains. Not as a physical place, but as a chapter of their lives that cannot be erased. They are the forgotten young prisoners, the ones who survived when survival seemed impossible, who carried scars invisible to the eye, but etched deeply in memory. Their story is one of loss and resilience, of childhood stolen and strength discovered. It is a reminder that in war, there are no true non-combatants, that children pay prices they should never have to bear. And it is a testament to the human capacity to endure, to survive, and to ensure that even the darkest chapters of history are not forgotten. The children of Santo Tomas lived through hell. That they emerged at all is a testament to courage that defied their years, and a will to survive that could not be broken, even by barbed wire and guards. Their voices, once silenced by captivity, now echo across decades, ensuring that the world remembers what happened when innocence met the brutality of war.